This may be the last interview of Rob Hall before he died on Everest in 1996. At that time, he was one of the strongest climbers in the world. Hall's Everest expedition proceeded without incident until the afternoon of May 10. Shortly after midnight on May 10, the expedition began the summit push from Camp 4 atop the South Col. They were joined by 3 other parties, Scott Pesher's Mountain Madness, as well as parties from Taiwan and India. As the climbers from 3 expeditions attempted to reach the summit, they quickly encountered a series of problems and delays. Upon reaching the Hillary Strip, the climbers found that no PEX ropes had been placed, and they were forced to wait for an hour while the guides installed the ropes. Things began to go seriously wrong. With a large number of climbers on the move at the same time, there were bottlenecks at the single fixed line at the Hillary Strip. As crucial time spent on laying new ropes, that tight scheduling for the climb began to slip. Many of the climbers had not yet reached the summit by 2 p.m. Rob Hall reached the summit at around 2:10 p.m. and was waiting for Doug Hansen to arrive as the weather was turning bad. At 3 p.m., with climbers still climbing far below, Hall's Sardar, Ang Dorje and other climbing Sherpas who had been waiting at the top began their descent from the summit. On the way down, Ang Dorje came across Doug Hansen from Hall's party above the Hillary Strip. Dorje ordered him to descend, but he refused. Exactly 1 year earlier, Hall had turned Hansen around the south summit at 2:30 p.m. due to time constraints and bad weather. Hansen had returned to Everest in 1996 largely as a result of Hall's advocacy. Rob called him from New Zealand, urging him to give it another shot, and this time Doug was determined to bake the top. Some speculated that this earlier failed attempt may have led Hall to disregard a timetable for safe descent that he himself had previously set. Hansen was allowed to summit, but shortly thereafter he was overcome by fatigue. Scott Pesher reached the summit at around 3:40 p.m. on the afternoon of May 10. His Sardar, Lobsang Jangbu Sherpa, was waiting for him at the top. Around this time, Makalugo and 2 Sherpas of the Taiwanese team arrived at the summit. Pesher was not feeling well. About 3:55 p.m., he started his descent. Shortly after Pesher left the summit, Gao and his Sherpas departed as well. And finally, Lobsang headed down, leaving Hall alone on the summit awaiting Doug Hansen. Around 4 p.m., Hansen finally appeared, moving up painfully slowly. Hall hurried down to help him the final 40 feet to the summit. Both stayed only a minute or two at the summit and then turned to begin the long descent. Hall sent his Sherpas down to assist the other clients and stated that he would remain to help Hansen. Although he knew that it could prove fatal, he made the decision to stay with Hansen. "100 meters down the summit, Hansen ran out of supplemental oxygen. He and Hall had been on the mountain quite longer than planned. Doug Hansen had expended every last bit of his strength to reach the summit. Now there was nothing left in reserve to make it back to Camp 4. At 4:30 p.m., Hall got on the radio to say that he and Hansen were in trouble high on the summit ridge and urgently needed oxygen. He remained with Hansen and tried to bring the nearly helpless client down without supplemental oxygen. But when they got to the top of the hillary step, he couldn't get Hansen down the 40-foot vertical drop. Around 5 p.m., a blizzard struck the southwest face of Everest, dropping visibility and wiping out the trail back to Camp 4 at South Col. Shortly afterward, Hall radioed for help, saying that Hansen had fallen unconscious but was still alive. At 5:30 p.m., guide Andy Harris began climbing to the hillary step with water and supplemental oxygen. At the time, Guy Carter, climbing partner of both Hall and Harris, was guiding an expedition on Mount Fumuri, a few miles from Everest Base Camp. He had been monitoring Hall's radio transmission throughout the day. He grew very alarmed. At 4:53 p.m., he got on the radio and strongly urged Hall to descend to the south summit and get some gas. Carter knew Hall wasn't going to be able to do anything for Doug without it. Rob said he could get himself down, but not with Doug. About an hour later, Hall was still with Hansen atop the hillary step, going nowhere. Carter implored his mate again to leave Hansen and come down alone because it was obvious that leaving him was his only choice. Hall chose not to desert his client in the storm and remain with him. Hall found it impossible to get Hansen down the face of the steep hillary step and refused to leave him there alone. Sometime later, he finally descended alone to the south summit. But at this point, neither Doug Hansen nor Andy Harris, who had risked his life to go to their rescue, were with him anymore. No one is certain what happened to Doug Hansen that night, but it has been conjectured that he lost his footing as Rob and Harris struggled to coax him down the mountain and fell 7,000 feet to his death. His ice axe was later found jammed into the ridge, above the sheer face down which he is speculated to have fallen. Doug Hansen finally achieved his dream of climbing Mount Everest, but at the cost of his life. What might have happened to Andy Harris remains even harder to discern. He was at the south summit with Hall on the night of May 10. His ice axe and jacket were found nearby. This implies that Harris died nearby. He experienced the effects of hypoxia, in which the brain is deprived of oxygen for too long. This led to disorientation and dementia. He was hallucinating while suffering from hypoxia. He seemed to believe that he was overheating, and so he took up his jacket, which led him to lose his balance and fall to his death. At 4:43 a.m. on May 11, close to 12 hours after the blizzard started, Hall radioed down and said that he was on the south summit. He was not breathing bottled oxygen because his regulator was too choked with ice. By 9 a.m., Hall had fixed his oxygen mask, but indicated that his frostbitten hands and feet were making it difficult to traverse the fake roofs. Around 9:30 a.m. on May 11, Ang Dorje and Lakfacheri left the south col and started climbing toward the south summit with a thermos of hot tea and 2 extra canisters of oxygen, intending to rescue Hall. They faced an exceedingly formidable task, as courageous as Anatoly's rescue of Sandy Fitman and Charlotte Fox had been the previous night. The wind was blowing in excess of 40 knots. They both were cold and wasted from climbing to the summit and back just the day before. Despite being spent and exhausted, they pressed on resolutely through severe storm toward Hall. At 3 p.m., however, still 700 feet below the south summit, the wind and sub-zero could prove to be too much for them, and they could go no higher. It was a brave effort, but it had failed, and as they turned around to descend, Hall's chances of survival all but vanished. Later in the afternoon, Hall radioed to base camp, asking them to call his wife, Jane Arnold, on the satellite phone. During this last communication, he reassured her that he was reasonably comfortable and told her, "Sleep well, my sweetheart. Please don't worry too much." He died shortly thereafter of exposure. Attempts to make radio contact with Hall later that night and the next day went unanswered. 12 days later, when David Brashears and advisors from the IMAX expedition climbed over the south summit on their way to the top, they found Hall lying on his right side in a shallow ice hollow, his upper body buried beneath a drift of snow. Thank you all so much for watching. If you like this video and new here, please consider subscribing to the channel for more such content to come in the future.